So our first speaker is Dr. Robert Hubert. He is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. Along with this, he is the interim director for the Centre for Military, Security and Strategic Studies. He's a senior fellow with the Laurier Macdonald Institute and a research fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He publishes on the issues of Canadian Arctic security, maritime security, and Canadian defense, and is often quoted in national and international media, and has expertise in the Arctic sovereignty and general Canadian security. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Robert Hubert.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I should say, of course, Pam and Veteran Affairs is also a fellow Winnipegger from me. And us fellow Winnipeggers know the Hubert part is for where you get chicken in Ottawa. The Hubert part, of course, is if you're from Winnipeg, and so just a minor little correction there. But I won't hold it against her because she's from Miles Mac, and we know River anyway. We are very privileged to be here, and to our honored veterans, thank you very much for everything that you gave to make our country what we are. We simply do not do enough. We do not recognize the fact that we as a society, we as a state, are in fact the results of the blood, of the efforts, of so much sacrifice. And I just cannot say enough in terms of the gratitude that I feel in terms of the recognition of what the veterans have done and what our serving military do. So thank you very much for those of you that have been here and are serving. I'd like to first of all begin by acknowledging that the University of Calgary and the military museums are located in the heart of southern Alberta. Both acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, Pinka, and Kiana First Nations, and the Suni First Nations, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chinook, Bearpaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nations of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. Now let me, for those of you that haven't had the opportunity yet to hear our story at the Centre for Military, Security and Strategic Studies, let me begin by first of all thanking Veterans Affairs and the Military Museum for being such wonderful host partners in terms of getting an understanding, sharing the examination of the significance of Canadians' military and security requirements. And so we are very happy to be able to continue what has been an ongoing series of discussions that we have had in cooperation with the Military Museum on issues of security. This is, of course, the fifth of a series of the Highlanders talks in which we've had a variety of discussions pertaining to the war in Ukraine, talking about the changing nature of nuclear deterrence and nuclear war fighting, cyber warfare, and other such issues. And so therefore, the discussions that we are going to be having today are a very good continuance of exactly what we are. Now, what is the Centre for Military, Security and Strategic Studies? For those of you that have not heard of us, we are one of Canada's major institutes that both believes in the importance on research into Canada's military and security. We are very proud of the fact that we look at issues pertaining to both the history, the current affair in terms of where we stand for Canadian defense and security policy, and trying to look into the future. If you are interested in those type of issues, if you want to share in terms of the legacies, we do such things, for example, in November under the leaderships of our guest speaker, John Ferris, and David Burkeson, our former director. We will be having in November a conference that will be celebrating the 100th anniversary for the Royal Canadian Air Force, but we will also be looking forward in terms of what it means for the Air Force. For those of you interested in maritime issues, we were just successful in raising a major research fund from the Department of National Defense that will run 3 years. We have Dr. Maureen Hebert, who is also beginning alternative means of force that she will be working with not postdocs, anyway, visiting lecturers that will be coming into the University of Calgary in terms of working, Matthew Combe, other fellows that we have on that. We have a very, very well-positioned set of fellows. Tim Stapleton, who is one of the leading experts in Canada on African security, is one of our fellows. Barry Cooper, who of course most of you will see on the media all the time, also in terms of other issues of security. And so we pride ourselves on being able to bring together a diverse group of scholars, but we also see the importance that we not only examine what in fact it means for Canadian security, but we also prepare the next generation. David Peabody, who of course is the director of the museum here, we're very proud of the fact that he is a former graduate of our program. We have a number of both current students and former students that have a whole host of issues. If you watch Mercedes Stevenson on Global, again, CMSS graduate. We recently had an event where we had individuals that are special advisors to the Secretary General, Secretary General of the UN. So we believe, we understand that in Canada, that if we do not understand what the vets have faced, if we do not understand and pay attention to the fact that we live in dangerous times, that we may wish away what we are facing in terms of the type of enemies that our vets faced on that day in D-Day, that if we do not understand it, we will suffer the consequences of that. And we are dedicated to ensuring that we are both trying to learn and appreciate both our history, but also our current, and that we are training those of the next generations to understand it. And so we are very proud to be here, to be able to share with you what exactly we are doing to facilitate it and to look out and to see this audience. No empty chairs. Once again, I think Calgary is unique in that context that we want to engage, we want to understand, and so we welcome that. And to that end, of course, I am more than privileged to be able to introduce our speaker of our fifth in a series of discussions of the Highlander series that we have. And that is Dr. John Ferris. Now, I've got his bio, and I don't like reading bios. But I can tell you this one thing. You know what the Brits are like. I'm sorry if anyone are the Brits here. But the idea that you would turn to someone from the colonies to write your official history on British cyber and signals intelligence, the official history, not a side book, not sort of a study, but the official history, and that you would turn to someone outside of Great Britain and someone in Calgary, I think that says it all for the bio of John Ferris. If you have not read Dr. Ferris's book on that official history, well, then don't bother watching the Imitation Game or anything in terms of trying to understand how intelligence was working during the Second World War, because you're not going to be interested. But I have to tell you, in terms of both his research, his cooperation as a colleague, and his ability to teach, John has no equivalent. And so we are very lucky to be able to hear John's discussions, not only in the context of what he is going to be sharing with us in terms of the overall intelligence leading to D-Day, but again, his willingness to engage and to participate in what I know is going to be an outstanding presentation and question period. So without further ado, I invite John, come up and please give us your thoughts.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you all of you for being here. I'm glad that we started out with those films from Veterans Affairs because I will come back to them at the very end of my lecture. And at the end, I'll be addressing the issue of, so what? Why does my topic matter? And the reason my topic matters is because it helps those men who went ashore to survive and win. And it does so very well. Now,
Could you put the microphone closer to your mouth, please?
how's this? You go ahead. How does that work? Okay. Now, I'm one of a relatively small number of historians who focus on the history of signals intelligence and also on military intelligence. And that's the reason why I became interested in the specific topic we're dealing with. Now, for what it's worth, the history of intelligence at the Battle of Normandy is actually fairly well known. And I think that a lot of you already have an idea of what it is that occurs. And what we understand correctly is that the Germans were badly fooled by British deception. They misunderstood the forces confronting them. They overestimated by about 40% the total number of British, Commonwealth, and American divisions in the world. They believed that there was a first United States Army group, including a Canadian Corps, in northern England that was actually going to be launching the main offensive. And that Corps and that Army group did not exist. The Germans simply were led to believe it. That the Allies had a very clear picture of German strength and understood a lot about German strategy. And that's all true. And I'll talk about that through the course of my lecture. But what I also want to emphasize is how much was uncertain and speculative in what the Allies knew about the Germans. And I want to emphasize the limits of intelligence as much as I do the success. Because as an historian of intelligence, what I would say is that between the summer of 1943 and the spring of 1945, Allied intelligence was about as good as you get. And they were up against what by that stage was a mediocre competitor. So really, you're not going to get a much better situation for one-sided intelligence than what occurs in the Battle of Normandy. And what I want to do, among other things, is highlight the limits to what superior intelligence can get you, and emphasize the fact that in the end, what really matters is how you deliver intelligence that can be used by commanders and soldiers in order to win and survive. Now, a number of different things are involved in the issues I'll be discussing. One is a competition between German intelligence, security, and deception, and Allied intelligence, security, and deception. Another is a difference between what you might call military rationality and intelligence. Now, by military rationality, all I mean is how do staff officers or commanders who are looking at a piece of terrain, looking at force strengths, looking at issues of time and space, how do they analyze what will happen? Well, if we look at this map here and look up at the far north of the map, you'll see something called the Pas de Calais, the northernmost portion of France. And of course, the map itself focuses on Normandy. Well, what occurs when British staff officers first do the assessment for the Battle of Normandy is this. They look at the map, they look at the circumstances and say, the obvious place for us to attack is the Pas de Calais. It's got wide open beaches, wide open rolling territory, a number of ports that we could capture, and precisely for that reason we can't attack there, because that's where the Germans will expect us to go. When the staff analyzed the other places that could be attacked, the conclusion was the only other real option is the Normandy Peninsula. There were other possibilities, but none of them really were capable of delivering the blow you wanted. And so that defined how the Allies planned to invade Normandy. They chose to try to deceive the Germans into believing that the attack would be launched on the Pas de Calais, while instead focusing everything on Normandy. Now, when the German staff officers, some months later, analyze the circumstances, they draw exactly the same conclusions, except they say the British are going to go to the Pas de Calais. Because being trained staff officers, using military logic, that's the obvious way to read it. Now again, when we get to the beginning of 1944, after the Allied staffs have had a number of months to go through planning, what they all do essentially is say, our original planning can't work. We've been trying to operate on the assumption we'll invade with 3 divisions on a narrow front, about half of the frontage that ultimately is selected at Normandy, but that's simply inadequate. If we try to do it, we'll lose. And what they said at that point is we need new commanders and we need to get more resources. So Eisenhower and Montgomery are brought in from the Mediterranean, are made the commander of the overall operation and of 21 Army Group, which does the planning, and they look at the situation and they draw exactly the same conclusions. What I want to emphasize is that when you look at the major strategic decisions which lead to the planning for Normandy, intelligence is irrelevant. What you're doing is looking at terrain, force, space, and you're saying, what can we do? And the same thing is true for the Germans. So in other words, that shows us a limit to intelligence right away. When it comes to issues of strategy and planning, intelligence is less significant than when it comes to lower level issues. Now, the next thing that's important to realize is there's a competition between Allied intelligence and deception, which is primarily British in this theater, and German intelligence and deception. Now, the Germans had been good earlier in the war, and in fact, especially on the Eastern Front, the Germans have a superiority in signals intelligence over the Soviets, which matches the superiority the British and Americans have over the Germans. But the Germans by 1943-44 are losing those capabilities. And in particular, in signals intelligence, the British create a revolution, which you know of in terms of what's often called ultra. In other words, they mechanize and mathematize signals intelligence. They're able to regularly break into the most elaborate cryptographic systems of the day and provide real-time information from that, which can guide decision-making. The Germans are in a very weak position. And if you look at what is occurring with Allied collection sources in the 9 months before the attack on Normandy, the British have extraordinarily good signals intelligence. British and Americans have extremely good air reconnaissance. French intelligence is quite good at this stage in terms of human sources. And the Germans fail in every way. Their human intelligence sources are absolutely controlled by British intelligence. In other words, their spies have been rounded up and are now either under control, sending messages to their handlers, or else British operators are sending messages to the German handlers. And so all the intelligence that the Germans get is actually what the British and Americans want them to have. German signals intelligence is so weak that it actually can't pick up messages the British are deliberately sending out to be picked up for purposes of deception. And essentially their air reconnaissance has collapsed. So in essence, the Germans are operating largely blind, but they don't really know it. So the situation is one where there's a great deal of superiority on the Allied side. And beyond that, what has to be emphasized is that Allied commanders trust their intelligence services, because by this stage, they've seen how good they are. And Montgomery is probably the Western commander who has the most experience in the use of intelligence at a battlefield. And although Montgomery is an odd character, he's actually a good consumer of intelligence. And I would also say he is the only Allied commander competent to handle an army group or above in Europe. So it's fortunate that, in fact, he's in 21 Army Group. Eisenhower is good for his level. And in fact, as time goes on, Eisenhower becomes quite effective. But he's really managing the high politics of command and determining whether or not an operation is really a good idea or not, rather than conducting them himself. Now, for what it's worth, German command in France is filled with able people. The difficulty is that the relationships between Adolf Hitler and his generals are so fraught that Hitler really complicates German decision-making. And as we'll see later on, that's actually one of the reasons why the British and Americans think it'll be much harder to get ashore than proves to be the case. And it's also one reason why the battle is won much more easily than anyone had thought. Now, the final points to think about before I get into details are these. If you look at the whole process of collecting intelligence from the summer of 1943 until June of 1944, the Allies are measuring a theater where the Germans are constantly rotating divisions in and out. Essentially, divisions that are ground down on the Eastern Front are sent to France, usually at 10 to 25% of their establishment strength. They're given drafts and new equipment, they build up their strength, and then very often they're rotated out. So it's actually very hard to determine which divisions are there or how many divisions are there. So from the point of view of the Allies, figuring out the enemy's strength is a matter of prediction. You know that what you're seeing today is probably not going to be like what you'll be seeing when the battle happens. And beyond that, because the Germans are being ground down everywhere, the quality of German formations is really hard to estimate. Now, when the Allies established the original conditions for invading Normandy in the summer of 1943, staff officers defined an upper level of German strength which will make it impossible, by which I mean impossible, for an invasion to succeed. And essentially what the Allies say is something like this. If there are more than 1,800 Luftwaffe aircraft in the front, and I'm talking really first line, not second line, we're going to find it very difficult to win the air campaign. And if there are 12 full-strength, first-quality German divisions that are able quickly to get to Normandy, we may well be sealed in and not be able to get off the beachhead. And here it's important to look at the experiences the Western Allies had of attacking German positions or French positions between 1942 to 44. When the Americans and British invade French North Africa, it's a success. And when the British invade Italy, it's a success. And when the British and Americans invade Sicily, it works. But when the Americans invade Italy, at Salerno, they're pinned on the beachhead, and they run into a serious position. And at Anzio, Anglo-American forces thrown ashore again are pinned on the beaches. So the experiences that the Allies have of launching assaults against German-held beaches, this is a very hard topic. And so the issue then of determining what real German strength is going to be becomes a very important one. And this is where the issues of uncertainty, etc., that I talked about earlier on come into play. Now, if any of you really want to know the evidence I'm using, tell me and I'll send you a reference that you can see more information than you'll possibly wish. But it's a complicated situation. So for example, in the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe builds up a larger strength which can be deployed to Normandy than the Allies 9 months before had believed they could overcome. Except that by the spring of 1944, the Allies realized that the Luftwaffe is declining rapidly in quality and is far inferior to British and American air forces. So, although when the Allies land, they expect to face far more Luftwaffe opposition than their original planning conditions would allow, they also essentially say, we can live with this because we know that we can beat them. And in fact, the Luftwaffe, when the battle starts, throws everything they have available in Western Europe, and scarcely a single aircraft actually survives to fly over the Normandy beachhead. So they're correct in this. But the problem of dealing with German army forces is very different. Because in 1944, the Germans still have a small but significant number of high-quality divisions. My guess would be that if you look at the 400-odd so-called divisions that the German army has in the middle of 1944, maybe 60 of them are any good. And a lot of them are really crap. There's a great tendency on the part of, I think, Western audiences to think the German army was great all the time. In fact, it was pretty crappy a lot of the time. But nonetheless, there are a lot of very good German divisions. The question is, how many of them will be in France? And in particular, how many of them will be in Normandy when your attack is launched? And the difficulty is because of the constant rotation of divisions in and out, and because of the interaction between the Eastern Front and the Italian Front and Normandy. Although you may know at any given moment how many divisions the Germans have in France, you can't know what will be the case in a couple of months. So in the early part of 1944, the Germans are keeping a lot of divisions for reconstruction and training purposes in France. And the British and Americans are scared of them. They're concerned about them. But in March, April, as the Soviet offensives begin to grind down the Germans, suddenly the Germans are rotating good divisions out of France. They're sending fragments back to be rebuilt. And it's very hard to predict what will happen. Now, April 1944 is the moment when all Western commanders and analysts are most happy with the state of the German army, when they're most optimistic that they can succeed. And that matters because planning for the Normandy invasion in every main area freezes in the latter part of April 1944. The naval commander essentially says, you cannot change any aspect of the amphibious portion of the assault, period, except fire plans on the beaches. So what that means is that you can't actually add more divisions. It's extremely hard to rearrange them. You can add airborne divisions. But essentially, April 1944 is the moment when you're making your bet on what the Germans are going to be. Now, the problem, unfortunately, from the point of view of the Allies, is that from April to June 1944, despite the annihilation the Germans are suffering on other fronts, Italy as well as the Eastern Front, the Germans rotate a large number of formations back to France. And indeed, to make matters even worse, between the 1st of May, 1944, and the 6th of June, 1944, the Germans more than double the garrison in the Normandy sector. Now that's because the Germans, as I say, assumed that the Pas-de-Calais was the major target to have to defend. And they focused all of the energies they had initially on strengthening the Pas-de-Calais. But by May, they're convinced that they're strong enough in the Pas-de-Calais that they can now start to build up the only possible alternative invasion site, and that's to say Normandy. So they more than double their strength at Normandy. And had the Allies not launched the attack they do on the 6th of June, they're going to have to wait until early July. And it's very likely that the Germans would have sent several more divisions to Normandy by that time, which might well have made the invasion impossible. So there's a moving target in terms of estimating what you're up against. Now, beyond that, the other issue is what exactly is the value of this little black box you call a division? And how many men and how many tanks are in a division? And it's here that massive problems emerge. The most obvious problem is the Allies cannot get a grip on what then are called tank states. Tank state essentially tells you how many runners, running armored fighting vehicles, you have in a formation. Now, from the early part of 1942 until the early part of 1944, Bletchley Park is reading these things on a daily basis. If you go through the Battle of El Alamein, every day, Bletchley can tell Montgomery exactly how many runners there are in German armored divisions. But nobody can do that in the spring of 1944. In fact, Bletchley doesn't start to be able to reconstruct that issue until the day of the invasion of Normandy. Now, what this means is that you know exactly how many armored divisions are in France, but you have no idea what their number of forces are, how they're organized. That's the kind of information that's hard to pick up from SIGINT. There aren't that many other sources. And so what you find is that every Allied command that's dealing with Normandy is actually making its own guesses. They will do arbitrary things like saying, we are going to assume that every German armored division has a full-strength battalion of Panther tanks, giving them 81 Panthers. Now, in fact, many of those divisions do not have any Panther tanks at all, and very few of them actually have a full-strength Panther division. But it's very difficult to figure out what the enemy's strength and armor is. And I'm going to exclude 21 Army Group from what I'm saying now, because in fact, as I'll show later on, they're very accurate. But in fact, you have estimates of the number of German tanks in France varying from about 1,400 to 3,000 being kicked around by commanders of different levels. And it doesn't matter how high up you are, you're still making these kinds of overestimates. Now, beyond that, there's almost a problem on the reverse in estimating the quality of German infantry and paratroop divisions. Now, on this issue, there is literally no intelligence whatsoever. It's actually hard to gather information on the real quality of divisions on the basis of the intelligence available to British and American planners. They make extremely arbitrary guesses. And essentially what they assume is that some divisions, especially if they're SS or they're paratroop, are going to be very good. And what they're defined as being full-strength, first-class divisions. They define another category of divisions which are not capable of launching an attack, but which are okay, they can stand up to assault, called lower establishment. And finally, they have a lower quality, which essentially says these are people who can hold a position with a lot of firepower, but you can't rely on them to move at all. And the Allies are trying to make guesses on the strength the enemy is going to have in good infantry divisions. Now, the problem is, in fact, the Allies have no real evidence to help them. What we now know is that there was virtually not a single German army infantry division in France that could be called full strength, first quality. There was one, 3rd Paratroop Division, which was actually better in strength than a German 1942 division would have been. But when you actually go through a detailed breakdown of strength and equipment, there's virtually not a single other German infantry division in France that is anywhere near a full-strength, first-quality division. But the Allies don't know this. And for them, this is where a nightmare potentially emerges. The planners look at how German forces have reacted to amphibious invasions in the past couple of years. And their conclusion is, boy, these guys move fast. They're well prepared. They only need a few hours to come up with good decisions. And within a day, they will have forces right on top of us. That had happened in Tunisia. It had happened in Sicily. It happened in Italy. And not surprisingly, in fact, I'd say almost inevitably, planners at higher levels say we have to assume that that's going to happen here. Now, why that matters is because the key problem that Allied planners are trying to solve is this. A, how do you get our men ashore? Which is not at all a simple task. In fact, Red Army observers who are attached to the Normandy operation are simply staggered by the complexity and proficiency of the Allied assault. But even assuming you get ashore, it's going to depend on how many German forces there are in the sector. And the Allies hope pretty consistently that there won't be more than 3 divisions on the ground when you attack Normandy. When they get there, in fact, it's slightly more than 6. But on top of that, the issue then is how many Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions are available, and how many good infantry divisions are there, and how quickly can they arrive? And when you go through all the planning calculations of time and space, it's a very scary phenomenon. Because in fact, given what you know about German strength, it's very easy to imagine that they will send everything they've got to Normandy immediately and be there somewhere between day 2 and day 7. Now, there's some variation for optimism and pessimism here. Some people say the Germans will be on us immediately. 21 Army Group, which is very good on these issues, says no. The Germans will not really be able to think about a major counteroffensive until D-Day +2. But at that moment, they will move right on top of us. Now, as it turns out, because of the weird nature of the command system that Hitler imposes on his generals, in fact, the Germans are much slower in moving than they thought. Allied air power, the French resistance, are able to really slow German movements. But if you were an Allied planner in, February, March of 1944, you would be assuming that if the Germans have 20 full-strength, first-quality divisions in France, every one of them will be on top of you by about day +8, or D-Day +8. Now, the dilemma is that the force buildup on the beachhead is limited by the number of ships you've got and by logistical considerations. So it's hard for you to really massively increase your buildup. Therefore, the stronger the Germans are in terms of numbers, the worse it looks. And in fact, Beadle Smith, who is Eisenhower's chief of staff, and I think one of the best American officers of the Second World War, actually quite despondently on the 1st of June, 1944, says to a friend, "I think that we can get ashore, but I think it's about 50-50 as to whether we can stay there or not." And these are not pessimistic people. These are people who are trying to be objective. Now, part of why they have this belief and why it's mistaken is because the Allies are unable to actually figure out the real strength of German infantry. Their assessment of the combat quality of German Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions is fairly good, but they're wildly too pessimistic about the quality of German infantry divisions. And in fact, if you look at the force buildup projections, which are made by staff officers in 21 Army Group, they're saying on, say, day +18, there will be this many German divisions on the front. What you find is that the Allied projections are absolutely right about Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions, but they grotesquely overestimate the number of infantry divisions the Germans can get there, and the reason is simple. Most of the German infantry divisions in France are crap. They're not capable of fighting very effectively. And in fact, the Germans do not deploy about a third of the infantry divisions they have in France to Normandy at all, partly because they're still deceived into believing that there'll be an invasion by the 1st United States Army Group on the Pas-de-Calais. But beyond that, because in fact, the men are not very good, they don't have equipment to move. Whenever they try to move, they're shot up by Allied aircraft or ambushed by the French resistance. So what you find out, I think, is that when you look at the assessments of strength that the Allies are operating on, they're accurate enough about German armor, despite the problems I mentioned earlier, and I'll explain why in a moment, but they are all significantly out about the strength in German infantry that can be sent forward. And why this matters, for those of you who know much about the Battle of Normandy, the problem the Germans face when they get to the front is they have to send their armored divisions to hold the front line against Allied infantry because they don't have infantry that can hold those positions. So in fact, there is an unintentional worst casing on the part of Allied intelligence and staff officers, which means they actually overrate German infantry strength. But to be frank, looking at the information they had available to them, I don't believe they did anything wrong. Worst case analysis has a bad reputation because it does prevent you from fully exploiting opportunity. But sometimes there are moments when it is better to be absolutely certain that you can handle a problem, and it's better off than underestimating the strength you need, and I think this is one of these cases. Now, I have a few more points left, and then I will be through. Among the many limits to Allied intelligence are issues that normally, in terms of military intelligence, are very easy to solve. In theory, with military intelligence, it should be pretty easy to know the strength of an enemy on your front line, to be able to work out what their tactical defenses are, to be able to work out something about their fire defenses. But you can't do that at Normandy. French civilians can't get to the German positions to see them. And the Allies can't focus on collecting intelligence on Normandy without tipping their hand. In other words, they have to not allocate the bulk of their resources to the topic, because that will give away where you're going. There's a rule of thumb that for every air reconnaissance mission flown over Normandy, 2 have to be flown over some other part of France. Once the invasion goes in, the Allies are able to triple their reconnaissance capability over German forces than before the invasion. Even more than that, the Allies are unable to capture any prisoner anywhere who has served in any divisions that matter in the Normandy theater. So prisoner of war and documentary collection, which are often very useful, can't give you anything in this particular instance. And even something as simple like a beach reconnaissance by frogmen, you have to be extremely careful about. From February 1944 onward, the Allies give up beach reconnaissance. With one exception, there is one mission around the Pas-de-Calais, which the Germans detect. It may well have been part of a deception effort to lead the Germans to focus on the issue. But the points I'm getting at are that there are huge amounts of issues about tactical intelligence that you can't get material on. Now, in an environment where every single German machine gun that you cannot suppress or destroy is in a position to tie down or kill hundreds of your own people, this is a great problem. And the irony is that had the Allies been able to use all of the collection material they had, they would have been able to answer these questions, but they can't before the invasion. Now, beyond that, there are issues like the terrain. So as we all know from the battle that ensues, one of the big problems are what is called bocage, which is the way French farms in Normandy are set up. Essentially what happens is the French create great rectangular fields surrounded by stone walls. That's an effective way to farm. It also proves to be an effective means of allowing the Germans to set up defense. Now, Allied staff and intelligence officers know about the bocage in advance, and they have no idea what it will mean. They don't know if it will work in the German advantage, they don't know if it won't work in the German advantage, and they don't prepare for it. And I would say myself that if you're looking for one area where things go wrong for the Allies, that's certainly one of them. Now, the deception campaign works at different levels for different reasons. The deception campaign essentially works because the British, and by the way, the Russians, round up essentially all German spies on their fronts, in the British case by early 41, and the Russian case by mid-42, and they turn them all. Or in the Russian case, you kill most of them and turn the rest. So what this means is that the Germans, who actually rely to an astonishing degree on human intelligence, spies normally are not highly regarded by military intelligence. Everything they get from human sources essentially is deceptive. The British in particular work out means of wireless deception, which complicate life for the Germans, etc., etc. Now, there are two different major outcomes from all of this. First of all, Hitler is actually taken prisoner by the agents the British have turned. It is clear that in the preparations for the Battle of Sicily, before the invasion of Normandy and during the first few days of Normandy, that Hitler believes deception from British-controlled agents that gets directly to him. And so it's very easy to show, in this instance, how deception has a major operational impact. On the other hand, lots of German army officers don't trust spies at all. And in fact, in some cases, when they're being interrogated after the war, when the word of spies is mentioned, they break out and laugh at British and American interrogators and saying, spies, you controlled them all. But this is where things become quite amusing. From a German point of view, the Commonwealth and American armies are really weird in many ways. But they're really weird in part because there's so few of them. The Germans recruit far more divisions per slice of 1 million men than the Commonwealth or Americans do, because we have strategic bombing, we have navies, we focus more on industrial production. And so from a German point of view, they just can't believe that it's possible that the Commonwealth and American armies are as small as they really are. And in 1941, a British staff officer in North Africa starts to exploit that fact. He starts to create non-existent formations and provide intelligence to the Germans about this Indian division, that West African division, etc., etc. And the German staff eats it all up because they're looking for evidence as to where this other 40% of the enemy armies are, and suddenly they're getting it. Now, why this matters is because it means that when we get to German consideration of the Battle of Normandy, they are open to believing that the British and Canadians and Americans have 40% more divisions than actually is the case. And it is only because of that that the First United States Army Group deceptive plan works. And by the way, the Germans go on expecting the major assault to be launched by the First United States Army Group on the Pas-de-Calais 2 months into the battle. And they're assuming essentially that the attack on Normandy is a feint and a pinning attack, which is intended to clear German troops away from the best possible place for the Allies to attack. Now, it has to be said that the effect of deception is important, but it's not necessarily as overwhelming as you will find when you look at some of the more laudatory literature on it. What it does certainly is really delay the movement of German forces to the front from day D+1 to about D+8, which really matters. Just like the fact that when the Germans send one of their best divisions in France, 2nd SS Panzer Das Reich, it's ambushed constantly on the way by French resistance forces, who forced the Germans to take 10 days to make a trip which normally they could do in 2. And the Germans do keep a large number of really mediocre, or even worse, German infantry divisions around the Pas-de-Calais until the very end. But certainly this helped. And from an Allied point of view, the confidence that you can see the Germans are not sending these forces forward is good. You can actually, when you go through the records, you can see a sigh of relief on the part of staff officers and commanders as they realize they're not being overwhelmed by the Germans. Now, the final point, well, I guess I'm on the second last point. Second last point is, how do the Allies get past these problems? Well, they get past the problems because in the end, intelligence and planning essentially is delegated to 21 Army Group. Montgomery is the best Allied commander before Normandy, and he and his intelligence officer, Bill Williams, are on very good terms. Bill Williams ultimately becomes a leading British academic, the principal of Wadham College in the 1970s in Oxford. But he's a very young man who comes to work for Montgomery before El Alamein. They come to a very trusting relationship, and they know each other. And as it turns out, what you have is a combination of a very competent intelligence officer and a very competent commander. When you go through all of the assessments put forward by all of the Allied commands before the invasion of Normandy, Bill Williams is far closer to the truth all the time. Now, in technical terms, what this means is that Bill Williams slightly underestimates the number of German forces that can actually intervene in the battle, which means that if any mistake occurs, if something he doesn't expect to happen occurs, that's going to make his projection slightly worse. So, for example, about midway through the Battle of Normandy, Hitler switches two SS Panzer divisions, number 9 and 10, from Poland to France. And so what this means is that suddenly the Germans are stronger than Williams would have predicted. But nonetheless, what he comes up with is a very accurate projection for soldiers, which shows what it is you can do, what you're going to be up against. And he doesn't lie. Even if he finds evidence that confirms a suspicion on his part, he will not do anything other than to say to his consumers, there is a possibility that you're going to find the enemy has doubled its strength here. But I can't yet be certain about that. But nonetheless, what I'd say in the end is that what makes the intelligence side of Normandy work as well as it does is a combination between extraordinarily good collection services, well-organized staff and intelligence organizations, and a large number of competent commanders and staff officers who make effective use of what they're doing. They're fortunate to be up against an enemy which is not nearly as good as they are in intelligence, and which is handicapped by the very peculiar way in which Hitler sets up a command system in France. But nonetheless, intelligence is a significant force multiplier, but it doesn't win the battle. And this is where I'd like to go back to the films we saw at the beginning of the presentation. Intelligence does not win wars. Now, if you're involved in a game of whist or bridge or poker, if you had intelligence, that might let you win a hand. If you're involved in a diplomatic bargaining situation, if you know what the other person wants or is intending to do, that might let you take a hand as well. But when it comes to war, a good army with crappy intelligence is going to beat a bad army with good intelligence. There's no way around it. That's simply the way history operates. And consequently, what I would say at the end of what I'm presenting is this. Allied intelligence essentially did all that you could expect intelligence to do. But there were certain problems it couldn't solve, certain questions it couldn't answer, because no intelligence service can give you a 100% accurate picture. But nonetheless, what they provided was a good enough picture of events, that good plans could be established, and then the men would have to do the rest. And as we know from the Battle of Normandy, that was not an easy thing to do. And lots of the men who were left to deal with that did not make it out either. But nonetheless, the combination of our skill and our courage and our people was enough to defeat the Germans in a campaign which I think Western countries and Canadians can take great pride in. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have for a while.
So we have roughly 15 minutes before we have to wrap up. So we have a mic, I think, that is running around there. Please put your hand up.
Hi, excellent presentation. Thank you very much. My name is Oscar Lozada. I'm an aficionado. All the information that I have is from books that I've read on my private time. So I feel to a certain extent that we get a lot of benefit of hindsight. So
Yes.
with that in mind, you made the point that intelligence improved tremendously in 1943. So was intelligent before the raid on Dieppe particularly inferior, and if so, why? And what real lessons were learned, taking into consideration that it was orders of magnitude smaller and the objectives were obviously not the same. So what lessons were really learned from the raid in Dieppe?
No lessons were learned from Dieppe that needed to be learned. In other words, what was obvious after Dieppe should have been obvious before Dieppe. Now, if you look at the issue of what intelligence is available, the British have a fairly clear picture of German strength in the theater, but they have no idea how quickly German forces will operate. They have no idea how quickly they can get to Dieppe. They're ignorant of some of the major factors in Dieppe. For example, if you're sending armor, including Churchill tanks, which are the most modern tank the British have at that point, onto the beach at Dieppe, actually the treads collapse very quickly. So there are all sorts of problems that the British can't get right. To carry that even further, if you go back to November 1941 and the British attack, which we call the Crusader Offensive, the British have a 99% accurate picture of German armored strength. The problem being they have no idea what individual German tanks or anti-tank guns will do to individual British tanks or British tactics. So in other words, you have to learn how your forces fight as well as being capable of providing intelligence on them. And the answer is that in 1942-43, the British become much better than the Germans or I think anybody else has ever been up to that stage. And so by 1944, they have a tried and tested system which integrates intelligence. But even in spring of 1942, the British are not regularly reading German army radio communications. So there's a big learning curve that goes on 42, 43, 44. Does that answer the question?
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
Yes.
Yes.
I was just gonna, at Veterans Affairs, we've been doing a lot of, well, I've learned a lot about the University of the Air Force,
Right.
and learned about people doing air reconnaissance out of North Africa, and the big, they're analyzing these photos they're taking and everything, and did that lead to the successes they were achieving initially in that theater, and then is it that the Luftwaffe and that the, ground artillery are able to stave off proper photo reconnaissance?
No, basically photo reconnaissance is fairly easy to do if you have the aircraft that can fly high enough and you've got cameras that can take lots and lots of photographs. So essentially, when the war breaks out, both the British and the Germans have small numbers of good aircraft with some decent imagery equipment. By 1941-42, they're both pretty good, but the Luftwaffe falls apart over the skies of Russia. Whereas the British do with imagery what they also do with signals intelligence. Basically, they find ways to collect, collate, process, and data retrieve material from imagery in a way that no other country does. And so, in fact, British and American imagery are extremely good. American imagery, however, doesn't really function in Europe. It's mostly in the Pacific. So American Air Forces, basically the American military in Europe is living off British intelligence. And everybody is happy with the outcome. There are no complaints.
Sir,
Having been at Bletchley Park and seeing the kind of processes that they were doing, and seeing your picture of the Enigma machine
Right.
when you were over there, your statement about the really restrictive intelligence that they had related to the abilities of the German army, it surprised me because I thought they were reading everything, or almost everything, and that those reports would actually include a lot of the kind of statements about what the quality of the invasion would have been.
You would, one would hope, but in fact, that's not the way even signals intelligence works. One of the first serious scholars of Ultra was a man named Rafe Bennett, who was actually a veteran of Bletchley, later became an Oxford Don. And what Rafe said, that's stuck in my mind ever since, is that Ultra provided a random selection of secrets. In other words, you couldn't read every Enigma key on a given day. Sometimes what you were focusing on, you were doing only so it would help you get entrance into another Enigma key. And there's a lot of stuff you can't get, period. And that I think is normal for intelligence. People assume that intelligence can give you much more material than is true. So you think of these espionage movies, right? Where you have people running down the street and they're getting real-time intelligence delivered to them from every signals and every imagery source you could imagine in a city. A lot harder than that. And beyond that, issues like ethnocentrism, how your assumptions affect the way you operate, the fact that any action, especially in war, leads immediately to outcomes that you may not have predicted. What it means is that intelligence is a lot less effective as a guide than you might think. Now, all generals and admirals of the Second World War loved SIGINT from every country because they all knew what it was and they all thought it was good. And that meant that even the Germans, when they were getting second-rate SIGINT, often could use it very well. But nonetheless, simply because you have a good intelligence system doesn't mean that it can win a battle for you. And that's really the heart of the point I'm making. People make decisions, intelligence doesn't.
I wasn't sure if somebody behind me or not. There's a Spanish citizen who went to work for the Brits as a double agent, Pujol, Garbo. How much, compared to what information he was falsifying and sending to Hitler versus Operation Fortitude South, who were sending fake messages all the time, because my father was one of the signalmen in the tunnels. And he had said that, sir, why are we sending these important messages from a code that we believe the Germans have broke? And the officer said, Mac, we want them to listen to what we are saying.
That does happen sometimes. I mean, I've actually seen authenticated cases where people use a system they know is compromised to communicate material they want the other side to pick up. But it doesn't happen as often in real life as you might think. Now, Juan Pujol was a very interesting character in the sense that he started out as a freelancer. There are lots of people at the beginning of the Second World War who pretend that they're intelligence officers and then fool intelligence services into buying their services. And the Germans fall victim to this in a number of places. But what the British discover with Juan Pujol is the Germans are paying real attention to this guy, but he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. So there's a famous moment when he talks about, I was in Glasgow last week, and you could buy any one of those Scotsmen for a bottle of red wine. Well, I think perhaps you could buy a Scotsman, it wouldn't be a bottle of red wine. But they deliberately brought Pujol to Britain because they said he's got enough access that if he works with us, he can be a very important figure. And in fact, Pujol is then part of Fortitude South. Essentially, Fortitude South rests on 5 or 6 controlled agents whom the British know the Germans pay attention to. How is that? Well, you are writing the messages they send. If the Abwehr, German military intelligence, is the recipient of the message and send it out in their systems, you're reading their codes. And if that intelligence affects German strategic decisions, there's a strong chance it will come out in ultra communications, which will mean you can see what they're actually doing. And so the British deception system really functions to a remarkable degree on a very good SIGINT, as well as a remarkable ability to round up all of the other side's agents. But as I said, the Soviets round up, by the middle of 1942, all the German agents they try to send out in the Eastern Front, and the Russians have a much less sophisticated, but quite successful, means of exploiting that material. The Germans are not fools. I mean, they make great mistakes in these areas, but they're not idiots. However, the German army of the Second World War falls victim to lots of institutional weaknesses, which ultimately makes it a very bad institution in terms of security and intelligence. Behind you, Mayor.
Hey there. I liked your point about how a good army with bad intel will always trump a bad army with good intel, right? Do you think that still rings true today, or has that changed over the past 80 years? We've had technological leaps and bounds. By comparison to modern conflict, is that still an accurate depiction of what war is like?
I'd stick to it, yes.
Yeah.
The other thing to bear in mind is that simply because one army has high-tech equipment and another doesn't is not automatically going to guarantee victory either. Sometimes huge mass armies beat small elite forces. Sometimes small elite forces smash big conscript armies. Sometimes high-tech wins a war for you. Sometimes low-tech beats high-tech. As Clausewitz says, every war is different. And the most important thing to do is determine which kind of war you're in, which I think is quite true.
Sorry, I wanted to ask about the intelligence failure. Who was responsible in the German side, and can you break that list? What led to that intelligence failure? Because, like you said, yeah, the modern one side and the other forces, on the other side, who was responsible on that side for the high command business?
The German state allows almost any organization which has any responsibility for security or military matters to create its own intelligence service. And they don't tend to cooperate. Whereas the British in particular centralize intelligence and try to ensure that everybody is contributing to the same pool and drawing from the same pool. Now, in the German case, in 1938, the Luftwaffe's intelligence service is very good. The German Navy's intelligence service is very good, and the German Army's intelligence service is okay. And when they first encountered British forces in 1940-41, in professional terms, it's a draw. It's about 50-50. The difference being that the British learn and the Germans don't. The British simply sit down and say, how can we improve our performance? And the fact that you have decision makers at the very top, like Winston Churchill, who regard intelligence as being very important, means that if you can draw his attention to something, he will give you the resources to do what you need. So in October 1941, there's a very famous moment when 4 codebreakers from Bletchley Park, who had been introduced to Churchill when he did a tour of Bletchley Park 2 months earlier, write a letter and hand deliver it to 10 Downing Street. And it's given to Winston Churchill. And basically what they say is, if you want us to do X, Y, Z, we need far more labor than we've got. If we do not have high priority for labor, we're not going to be able to give you what you want. Churchill looks at the letter, writes, give them what they want, action this day, and hands it over to his staff. And in fact, very quickly, Bletchley becomes the #1 priority in Anglo-American strategic resources, by which I mean it can get whatever it wants. Now, the Manhattan Project gets far more, correctly, than Bletchley does, but everything Bletchley asks for, it gets, almost immediately. So the situation is one in which, because the British and Americans both treat intelligence as being a #1 priority, and because they both send high-quality personnel into it, they end up developing better and better intelligence services. Until by the end of the war, I have to say, as a historian of intelligence, I've never seen anything like it. When I was able to write my official history of GCHQ, I felt honored to be able to, following what these people had been doing and what they did, because I've never seen such high-quality brain work in my life. I'm a military historian. I don't normally deal with the thoughts of mathematicians, but boy, these guys are good.
We have time for one more question. Seeing none. Well, at this point, I would like to thank Dr. Ferris for being able to share some very important thoughts. I think that what he brings to the table in the discussions, going behind what we all understand in terms of the successes of D-Day is, of course, of fundamental importance to the overall strategy. So on that point, thank you very much, Dr.